February 1959, high in the northern Ural Mountains, winter had taken full control of the landscape. Temperatures plunged far below freezing, wind moved across the open slopes like a blade, snow drifted in waves across the mountain ridges, erasing tracks almost as quickly as they were made. In this environment, mistakes were rarely forgiven, and survival depended on preparation, discipline, and experience. 9 hikers had set up camp for the night on an exposed slope beneath a mountain known locally as Kholat Syakhl. The name roughly translates to Dead Mountain. The group was led by Igor Dyatlov, a 23-year-old engineering student and an accomplished winter hiker. These were not reckless adventurers. They were experienced, trained, accustomed to the brutality of winter expeditions. Their tent was anchored against the wind, their equipment carefully organized. Inside were boots, heavy coats, food, everything necessary to survive the night. But sometime after darkness fell, something changed. Something forced them to leave the tent. Not gradually, not carefully, suddenly. The tent fabric was later found cut open from the inside, as if the fastest escape route was not the door, but the knife. Footprints in the snow showed the hikers moving down the mountain, not running, but walking, barefoot, or wearing only socks, into temperatures that could kill a person in minutes. The forest stood nearly a mile away, in darkness, in blizzard conditions. When rescuers finally located the campsite weeks later, the scene was deeply unsettling. The tent remained partially standing, supplies untouched, personal belongings left behind, but the hikers themselves were gone. Their bodies would eventually be found scattered across the mountainside, some near a dying campfire, others farther away, one by one. Some had died from the exposure, others suffered injuries so severe that investigators compared them to the impact of a car crash. One victim was missing a tongue. Some clothing tested positive for radiation. And to this day, no explanation fully accounts for what happened on that mountainside. The case would become known as the Dyatlov Pass incident. More than 60 years later, it remains one of the most haunting mysteries of the modern era, because the question that echoes through the frozen silence of that mountain is a simple one. What could have terrified 9 experienced hikers enough to make them abandon everything and run into the freezing night? In the winter of 1959, a group of young Soviet hikers set out on what at the time was considered a challenging but achievable expedition. Their journey would take them deep into the remote wilderness of the northern Ural Mountains. The goal was ambitious: to complete a demanding winter trek across some of the harshest terrain in the Soviet Union and reach the remote sudden of Otorten Mountain. Winter expeditions in this region were not casual adventures. They were tests of endurance. To earn the highest level of Soviet hiking certification, participants were required to complete long-distance treks through extreme winter conditions. Deep snow, violent winds, temperatures that could drop below negative 30 degrees Celsius. The expedition was led by Igor Dyatlov, a 23-year-old engineering student at the Ural Polytechnic Institute. Dyatlov wasn't simply the organizer of the trip, he was its strategist. Friends described him as calm, methodical, and deeply analytical. His background in radio engineering shaped how he approached outdoor expeditions. Routes were carefully mapped, equipment lists were meticulously planned. Even the group's large expedition tent had been modified by Dyatlov himself, redesigned to better withstand the brutal winter winds of the Urals. Leadership in these conditions required more than just confidence. It required trust, and Dyatlov had earned that trust from the people hiking beside him. Because in the remote wilderness, decisions can mean the difference between survival and disaster. The expedition included 10 members in total, most of which were students or recent graduates from the same university. Young, intelligent, adventurous, but importantly, experienced. These were not amateurs wandering into dangerous terrain. Many had already completed difficult expeditions together. They knew the risks and they trusted one another. Among them was Zinaida Kolmogorova, known among her friends for her relentless energy and optimism. She was the kind of person who kept morale high even when conditions became difficult. There was also Lyudmila Dubinina, remembered for her strong will and determination. Those who knew her often described her as fearless, someone who refused to give up when the terrain turned harsh. Rustem Slobodin was one of the most physically capable members of the group. He had the endurance of a trained athlete and a reputation for pushing himself beyond normal limits. Each member brought something different to the team, different strengths, different personalities, but together they formed something essential for expeditions like this: a cohesive group. The kind of group that can endure days of exhausting travel through snow-covered wilderness. Their equipment reflected their preparation: long wooden skis designed for deep snow travel, heavy winter clothing layered for insulation, axes and saws for gathering firewood, cooking equipment, and portable stoves. They also documented the journey carefully: photographs, journals, notes about weather conditions and terrain. These records would later become some of the most haunting artifacts connected to the expedition because they captured moments of ordinary life. Moments that, in hindsight, feel painfully normal. Photographs show the hikers laughing as they struggle through deep snow, helping each other pull equipment sleds, posing playfully for the camera. At night, they gathered in the tent, sharing stories and singing songs to pass the long winter evenings. But the landscape they were entering was unforgiving. The northern Ural Mountains are not dramatic peaks like the Alps. Instead, they're wide, exposed ridges where wind can build into violent storms with little warning. Snow can bury landmarks overnight. Visibility can disappear within minutes. And once you're deep enough into the wilderness, there's no easy retreat. The route would eventually take them toward a slope beneath a mountain called Kholat Syakhl. The name comes from the language of the indigenous Mansi people, and it translates roughly to Dead Mountain. The name has become famous because of what happened later, but historically, it likely referred to the barren landscape. Wildlife was scarce, vegetation was limited, the environment itself felt harsh and empty. To the hikers, however, it was simply another waypoint along their journey, another challenge to overcome. On January 28th, however, something unexpected happened. One member of the group began suffering from severe joint pain. His name was Yuri Yudin. After discussing the situation with the others, Yudin made the difficult decision to turn back. It wasn't an easy moment. These were friends who had trained together and prepared for the expedition for months, but the wilderness allows little room for compromise. If Yudin continued in his condition, he risked slowing the group and placing everyone in danger. So he said his goodbyes and began the long journey back toward civilization. Before leaving, he helped redistribute some of the supplies among the others. There are photographs from this moment. The hikers standing together, smiling, relaxed. There's no visible sense of foreboding, just a group of friends saying goodbye before continuing their adventure. It would be the last time any of them were seen alive. Yuri Yudin would later become the only member of this expedition to survive, a twist of fate that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The remaining 9 hikers continued deeper into the mountains. They skied across frozen valleys, climbed windswept ridges, and recorded their progress through photographs and journal entries. Slowly, steadily, they approached the slope where they would pitch their final camp. At the time, it would have just seemed like another night in the wilderness, another cold evening, another tent anchored against the wind, but history would remember that decision very differently. Because sometime during the night of February 1st, on the slopes of Kholat Syakhl, something happened. Something powerful enough to drive 9 experienced hikers out of their shelter and into the freezing darkness. By the end of January 1959, the expedition had moved far beyond the last signs of civilization. The forest grew denser, the terrain steeper, and the weather more unpredictable. Each day, the group pushed deeper into the northern Ural Mountains, navigating by compass and map across an environment that offered few landmarks and even fewer guarantees. Their progress was slow, but steady. Winter expeditions rarely move quickly. Deep snow forces hikers to break trail, each step sinking into drifts that can reach the knees or higher. The lead skier cuts a path through the snow, then rotates with the others to share the burden. It's exhausting work, but the group had done this before, and the journals they left behind reveal something striking. Despite the harsh conditions, morale remained high. Entries describe laughter, songs sung inside the tent at night, playful teasing between members of the group. The photographs recovered from their cameras show scenes that feel almost ordinary. One image captures hikers trudging uphill through blowing snow. Another shows them pausing along the trail, smiling at the camera. In one photograph, the group even appears almost carefree. Bundled in heavy clothing, skis slung over their shoulders, faces flushed from the cold. These moments are important because they show no sign that anything was wrong, no indication of fear, no hint of the mystery that would soon surround their journey. On January 31st, the hikers reached the edge of the forest. Ahead of them stretched a wide, exposed slope leading toward Kholat Syakhl. The wind here was stronger, the snow thinner, and more wind-packed. Travel across open terrain like this is far more dangerous than moving through the trees. There's no shelter from the wind, no protection from sudden storms, but crossing the slope would allow them to maintain altitude to continue their route towards Otorten Mountain. That day, however, conditions began to deteriorate. Visibility dropped as snow began to fall. Wind swept across the ridges, carrying loose snow in waves that obscured the landscape. At some point during the climb, the group realized they had drifted off their intended route. In the mountains, this happens easily. A few degrees of error, a moment of poor visibility, and suddenly the landscape no longer matches the map. Rather than descend back into the forest to regroup, they made a decision. They would pitch their tent on the mountainside. From there, they could resume the route in the morning. It was not an unreasonable choice, but it placed them directly on the exposed slopes beneath Kholat Syakhl, a location vulnerable to wind and isolated from the shelter of the trees below. Late that afternoon, the hikers began preparing camp. Using skis and poles, they constructed a large shared tent. Snow was packed around the base for insulation, and inside the group arranged their equipment carefully. Boots near the entrance, outer clothing stacked nearby, cooking gear prepared for the evening meal. Photographs taken that day show the hikers working in fading daylight. In one of the final images recovered from their camera, a figure is seen walking through the blowing snow. The image is grainy, partially blurred by wind and motion, but it captures something subtle, a sense of isolation. The mountain around them appears vast and empty, the sky low and gray. Night would fall quickly in these conditions. Once darkness arrived, the temperature would drop sharply, but inside the tent, the hikers would have been relatively safe. Protected from the wind, sleeping close together for the warmth, just another night in the wilderness, another routine stop on a difficult expedition. At some point after nightfall, they likely prepared their evening meal, removed their boots, and settled into their sleeping positions inside the tent. Outside, the wind continued to move across the slope, snow drifting silently across the mountainside. Inside the tent, the group would have been relaxed, perhaps talking quietly, perhaps already asleep. But sometime during the night, something changed. Something powerful enough to force 9 experienced hikers to cut their way out of their own shelter. Something that convinced them that leaving the tent, without boots, without coats, without protection, was safer than staying inside. And whatever that something was, it happened in the dark. The Dyatlov expedition was expected to return by mid-February. Winter expeditions often run behind schedule, so when the group failed to arrive on time, the delay didn't immediately cause alarm. But as days passed with no communication, concern began to grow. Friends and family began contacting the Ural Polytechnic Institute asking whether the hikers had returned. They hadn't. Eventually, pressure from relatives pushed authorities to begin an official search. At first, the effort was limited. The Soviet Union was vast, and winter conditions in the Ural Mountains made search operations extremely difficult. But as the days stretched on, more people became involved. Volunteer hikers joined the effort, students from the university, local rescue teams, eventually even military personnel. Helicopters began scanning the region from the air. From above, the mountains looked deceptively calm, white ridges stretching endlessly towards the horizon, snow covering everything in a quiet, frozen blanket. But beneath that surface, something had gone terribly wrong. Nearly 3 weeks after the group's last known communication, searchers finally spotted something unusual on the mountainside. It was a dark shape partially buried in snow. The expedition tent. The location was exposed, perched on a slope beneath Kholat Syakhl. Wind had partially collapsed the structure, snow had drifted against the sides, but the tent was still standing. Searchers approached cautiously. What they found immediately raised questions. The tent was empty. Inside were the hikers' belongings: boots, heavy coats, equipment, food, everything they would normally take with them if they planned to leave the camp. But the most disturbing discovery came moments later. The fabric of the tent had been cut open from the inside. Several slashes ran through the canvas walls, large enough for a person to crawl through. The hikers hadn't exited through the normal entrance, they'd escaped through the side of their own shelter, as if the door wasn't fast enough. Investigators began carefully examining the surrounding snow, and soon they discovered something even stranger. Footprints, clear impressions leading away from the tent. 9 separate sets. The tracks moved downhill toward the distant tree line nearly a mile away. What made the tracks unsettling was not their direction, it was what they revealed about the hikers themselves. The footprints showed that several members of the group were barefoot. Others wore only socks. Some appeared to have been wearing a single boot. In temperatures estimated to be around -30 degrees Celsius. At those temperatures, exposed skin can freeze within minutes. Hypothermia can begin shortly after, yet the hikers had left the tent like this anyway. The tracks themselves did not suggest panic, they didn't appear to be running, instead they just moved steadily downhill, almost as if the group had left deliberately. But why? Why would experienced hikers abandon their shelter, cut their way out of their tent, leave behind boots and winter clothing, and walk into the freezing darkness? Whatever happened that night had convinced them that remaining inside the tent was more dangerous than the cold outside. Search teams began following the tracks, but the trail did not last forever. Wind and drifting snow had begun erasing the footprints. After several hundred meters, the impressions became faint. Eventually, they disappeared entirely. But by that point, the direction was clear. The hikers had moved toward the forest below the slope. The trees offered the only real shelter in the area. If the group had been forced to leave the tent quickly, the forest would have been the most logical destination. Searchers began descending the mountain, and what they would find there would only deepen the mystery, because the first bodies were waiting at the edge of the trees. Following the faint trail of footprints down the mountainside, the search teams moved slowly toward the forest below. The trees offered the only natural shelter in the area. In winter conditions like these, anyone forced out of their tent would instinctively move toward the forest. The trees could block the wind, provide firewood, offer some sort of protection from the brutal cold. So when the footprints led in that direction, the rescuers hoped the hikers had made it that far. But as they approached the tree line, the search teams began to notice something unusual. Broken branches, snow disturbed around the base of a large cedar tree, and beneath that tree, partially buried in the snow, they found the first 2 bodies. They were Yuri Kravanishenko and Yuri Doroshenko. Both men were barefoot. Both were wearing only light clothing despite the brutal temperatures. Between them was the remains of a small fire, charred branches scattered in the snow, evidence that they had attempted to warm themselves after fleeing the tent. But the fire hadn't been enough, the cold had taken them first. Investigators also noticed something strange about the cedar tree above them. Several branches had been broken nearly 5 meters above the ground, as if someone had climbed the tree, perhaps trying to see the tent on the slope above or watching for something in the darkness. The 2 bodies showed signs of severe frostbite, but there were also unusual abrasions on their hands and skin. Some investigators believe these injuries came from the men tearing branches from the tree in desperation, trying to keep the fire alive, trying to survive. But the discoveries didn't stop there. Between the cedar tree and the abandoned campsite, rescuers found 3 more bodies scattered across the snow, each lying at a different distance from the forest, each facing uphill toward the tent. One of them was Igor Dyatlov himself. He was found lying on his back, one arm positioned as if shielding his face, the other extended outward, his body pointed toward the slope where the tent had been discovered, as though he had been trying to make it back. Not far from him was Zinaida Kolmogorova. She had traveled farther than the others before collapsing nearly 600 meters from the tree, also facing the direction of the tent. Investigators concluded that these hikers had likely attempted to return to the campsite, but the cold had overtaken them before they could reach it. Another body, Rustem Slobodin, was discovered between them. At first glance, his death appeared similar to the others, but later examination revealed something unexpected. He had suffered a fracture to the skull. The injury wasn't immediately visible, and investigators were uncertain how it had occurred. Yet even stranger discoveries were still waiting beneath the snow, because the remaining 4 hikers were not found until months later. Spring eventually arrived in the Ural Mountains. As the snow began to melt, search teams returned to the area, and in a ravine roughly 70 meters beyond the cedar tree, they discovered the final members of the expedition. The bodies were partially buried beneath several meters of snow. Their location suggested they had attempted to build some kind of shelter, perhaps a snow cave, perhaps a defensive hollow against the wind, but when investigators examined the remains, they encountered the most disturbing evidence of the entire scene. One of the hikers, Lyudmila Dubinina, had suffered catastrophic internal injuries. Her ribs were crushed. The force required to produce such damage was enormous, yet there were almost no external wounds. No deep cuts, no obvious trauma to the skin. Another member of the group, Semyon Zolotaryov, had also sustained massive chest trauma. Again, investigators compared the injuries to those seen in victims of severe car crashes. But no vehicle had been present on that mountainside, no evidence of a fight or struggle had been found, and perhaps the most haunting detail involved Dubinina herself. When rescuers examined her body, they discovered that her tongue was missing, as were parts of the soft tissue in her mouth. At first, this fueled speculation about violence or mutilation, but later investigators suggested that decomposition and scavenging animals could explain some of the missing tissue. Still, the detail added to the growing sense of unease surrounding the case. Further analysis revealed something else unusual. Several items of clothing recovered from the victims contained traces of radioactive contamination. The levels were not immediately lethal, but the presence of radiation raised new questions. Where had it come from, and why were only certain pieces of clothing affected? As investigators pieced together the evidence, the scene on the mountainside began to form a grim narrative. 9 hikers had fled their tent in the middle of the night under extreme conditions. Some reached the forest and attempted to build a fire. Others tried to return to the campsite. The last group sought shelter in the ravine. But the injuries, the radiation, and the strange condition of the bodies suggested that something more complicated had happened that night. Something that investigators could not easily explain. And as the case unfolded, the mystery surrounding the Dyatlov Pass incident only grew deeper. By the time investigators had recovered all 9 bodies, the broad outline of the tragedy seemed to be taking shape. The hikers had abandoned their tent during the night, they had attempted to survive in the forest, and the brutal cold of the Ural Mountains had ultimately claimed them. But when the autopsies were completed and investigators began examining the details more closely, something became clear. The evidence didn't settle into a simple explanation. Some of the injuries were difficult to reconcile with the environment where they occurred. Take the trauma suffered by Lyudmila Dubinina. Her ribcage had been crushed with enormous force. Multiple ribs were broken. Medical examiners noted that the level of internal damage resembled injuries normally associated with severe collisions. But there was a problem with that comparison because the surrounding tissues showed surprisingly little external trauma. No deep lacerations, no massive bruising, no clear sign of a violent blow. It was as if her body had been subjected to tremendous pressure without the kind of surface injuries normally expected from such force. A similar pattern appeared in the injuries of Semyon Zolotaryov. He too had suffered catastrophic damage to his chest. Investigators again concluded that the amount of force required would normally be seen in major impacts, the kind associated with serious crashes or structural damage. Yet on that isolated mountainside, there was no vehicles, no falling debris, no clear mechanism capable of generating such trauma. The injuries alone would have been unusual, but other details made the investigation even more complicated. One of the most widely discussed aspects of the case involved the condition of Dubinina's body. When search teams recovered her remains from the ravine, they discovered that her tongue was missing, along with portions of soft tissue from the mouth and face. At first glance, the details seemed deeply disturbing, but later forensic analysis suggested a more mundane explanation. Bodies exposed to harsh environmental conditions for extended periods often experience significant decomposition. Soft tissues are among the first to deteriorate. Scavenging animals and natural processes could account for some of the missing tissue as well. Even so, the discovery added to the growing sense that the events on the mountainside had unfolded in unusual ways. And then there was the issue of radiation. During the forensic examination of the hikers' clothing, investigators detected measurable traces of radioactive contamination on the garments. The levels were not dangerously high, but they were clearly present. This discovery raised new questions. Where did the radiation come from? Some members of the expedition had previously worked in industrial environments where radioactive materials were handled. In the Soviet Union during the 1950s, exposure to low levels of radiation in certain workplaces was not unheard of. But the finding nevertheless added another layer of uncertainty to the investigation. And then there were the reports of the strange lights in the sky. During the weeks surrounding the Dyatlov expedition, witnesses in nearby settlements reported seeing glowing orange spheres moving silently across the night sky. These sightings were documented in local records. Some observers described the lights as bright objects drifting slowly across the horizon. Others believed they might have been military flares or experimental aircraft. Speculation soon followed. Some believed the lights were connected to secret Soviet weapons testing. Others suggested atmospheric phenomena. Because of the secrecy surrounding the Soviet military activities during that period, investigators were never able to fully confirm whether any experimental tests had taken place in the region. Even the official case file reflected the uncertainty. After months of investigation, Soviet authorities eventually closed the case. Their conclusion was brief and strangely ambiguous. The hikers, the report stated, had died due to a compelling natural force. No further explanation was provided, the files were archived, many of the documents remained classified for decades, and with that single phrase, a compelling natural force, the official investigation ended. But the mystery didn't, because the details left behind on that frozen mountainside continued to resist a clear narrative. The injuries, the radiation, the strange lights reported in the sky. Individually, each detail might have had a reasonable explanation. But taken together, they formed a puzzle that investigators could never fully resolve. And when evidence refuses to settle into a single story, speculation inevitably fills the gaps. Theories began to emerge, some grounded in science, others drifting toward the edges of conspiracy because the question still remained. What could have forced 9 experienced hikers to abandon their shelter and run into the freezing darkness? For decades, the Dyatlov Pass incident has occupied a strange space between tragedy and unsolved investigation, because the evidence left behind on that frozen mountainside does not point clearly toward a single cause. Instead, it suggests possibilities. Each theory attempts to explain the same troubling facts. 9 experienced hikers, a tent cut open from the inside, barefoot footprints leading into the snow, and injuries that seem difficult to reconcile with an empty wilderness. Over the years, investigators, scientists, and amateur researchers have proposed a wide range of explanation. Some grounded firmly in environmental science, others drifting into the realm of speculation. The most widely accepted theory today involves an avalanche, not the massive wall of snow often portrayed in films, but something much more subtle, a slab avalanche. In certain mountain environments, wind can pack snow into dense horizontal layers across a slope. If one of those layers fractures, a compact slab of snow can slide suddenly downhill. The movement may only travel a short distance, but the force can be significant. Researchers studying the terrain near Kholat Syakhl have suggested that the hikers may have unknowingly pitched their tent beneath one of these unstable slabs. If the slab shifted during the night, even slightly, it could have partially collapsed the tent or created the fear that a larger avalanche was imminent. In the darkness, under intense pressure, the hikers may have reacted quickly, cutting their way out of the tent, moving downhill, seeking the protection of the forest below. The theory also offers a potential explanation for the internal injuries suffered by some members of the group. Dense blocks of compacted snow can exert enormous force when they move, especially if victims are thrown into terrain features like the ravine where the final 4 hikers were discovered. In 2020, Russian authorities revisited the case and formally concluded that a slab avalanche was the most likely explanation. From a scientific perspective, the scenario is plausible, but many observers remain unconvinced because some details still remain difficult to reconcile. Avalanches often leave clear physical evidence, large debris fields, significant snow displacement. Yet search teams in 1959 reported relatively limited signs of avalanche activity near the campsite. Another explanation involves a lesser-known atmospheric phenomenon called infrasound. Under certain wind conditions, air moving across mountain ridges can produce powerful low-frequency vibrations. These sounds fall below the range of human hearing, but they can still affect the body. Some researchers believe prolonged exposure to intense infrasound can trigger feelings of anxiety, panic, and disorientation. If such conditions developed on the slopes of Kholat Syakhl, it's possible the hikers experienced sudden fear or confusion during the middle of the night. That panic could have driven them out of the tent, and once outside, the brutal cold would have quickly transformed a frightening situation into a deadly one. Other explanations point toward military activity. During the late 1950s, the Soviet Union was actively testing new weapon systems, including experimental parachute mines. These devices detonated above the ground, creating powerful shockwaves capable of producing severe internal injuries. Some researchers have proposed that a series of distant explosions could explain both the hiker's sudden flight from the tent and the unusual trauma discovered during the autopsies. But hard evidence linking such tests to the Dyatlov expedition has never been confirmed, and the remote location of the campsite does make the theory difficult to verify. Then there were the reports of strange lights in the sky. In the weeks surrounding the expedition, multiple witnesses in nearby settlements described seeing glowing orange spheres drifting across the night sky. Some observers said the lights moved silently, others reported that they hovered briefly before continuing across the horizon. These sightings were documented in regional reports and later referenced during discussions of the Dyatlov case. At the height of the Cold War, many assumed the lights were connected to the secret Soviet military activity, experimental rockets, high-altitude flares, or missile tests conducted in remote regions. But because military programs of that era were heavily classified, investigators were never able to confirm exactly what those lights were. Over time, the reports began to take on a different interpretation. Some researchers wondered whether the hikers themselves may have seen something unusual in the sky that night, something unexpected enough to drive them out of their shelter in alarm. That idea eventually evolved into one of the more dramatic theories surrounding the incident, the possibility that the hikers encountered an unidentified aerial phenomenon. There's no direct evidence supporting that claim, but the reports of glowing spheres remain one of the more intriguing background details of the case, because they occurred during the same weeks the expedition disappeared, and they were reported by witnesses who had no connection to the hikers themselves. Each explanation attempts to reconstruct what might have happened on that mountain. Each solves certain pieces of the puzzle, and each leaves others unresolved. The avalanche theory explains the sudden evacuation, but struggles with the limited physical evidence. Infrasound might explain panic, but does not easily account for the severe injuries. Military testing could explain the trauma, but lacks documentation placing such experiments near the campsite. And so the mystery remains suspended between these possibilities, because whatever happened on that mountainside likely unfolded in minutes, in darkness, in brutal winter weather, under conditions that erased most of the evidence before investigators ever arrived, which means the final explanation may never be known with certainty. But the story of the Dyatlov Pass incident endures because it sits at the intersection of human curiosity and the unpredictable power of nature. 9 people entered those mountains prepared for danger, but something happened that night that no one anticipated, and the mountain has kept its silence ever since. More than 60 years have passed since the events on the slopes of Kholat Syakhl. In that time, countless investigators, scientists, journalists, and researchers have studied the case known as the Dyatlov Pass incident. Documents have been re-examined, photographs analyzed, new theories proposed, and yet the central question remains unresolved. Because whatever happened that night unfolded in a place where evidence disappears quickly. Snow falls, winds shift, tracks vanish, nature erases its own history. But beyond the forensic details and the competing theories lies something far simpler. 9 people set out on an expedition together. 9 friends who trusted each other. 9 individuals who believed they understood the risks of the wilderness, and only one of them returned. The last person to see the group alive was Yuri Yudin. When illness forced him to leave the expedition early, he said goodbye to the others and began the journey back towards civilization. At the time, it felt like a disappointment, a missed opportunity, but that decision would ultimately save his life. For the rest of his life, Yudin carried the weight of that moment. He was the only member of the expedition who could describe the group before they vanished into the mountains. He remembered their laughter, their excitement, their determination to complete the journey. And like everyone else who studied the case, he spent decades wondering what had happened after he left. In interviews later in life, Yudin often returned to the same thought, that somewhere on that mountainside, the group encountered something unexpected, something that forced them into a series of desperate decisions made in darkness, in freezing wind, in conditions where even small mistakes could become fatal. Perhaps the explanation is ultimately simple. A sudden avalanche, a collapse of snow, a chain of events that spiraled beyond anyone's control, or perhaps the full truth was lost in the storm that night. Because extreme environments don't always leave behind clear answers, and sometimes the difference between survival and tragedy can be measured in minutes. Today, the slope where the hikers made their final camp bears a different name. It's known as Dyatlov Pass, named after Igor Dyatlov, whose leadership brought the group into the mountains and whose name would forever be tied to the mystery that followed. Visitors occasionally travel to the area, researchers still examine the case, but the mountain itself remains unchanged. Wind moves across the ridges, snow gathers in silent drifts, and the slope where the tent once stood has long since returned to its natural state. The wilderness keeps its secrets well, and whatever happened on that cold February night in 1959 remains buried beneath the snow. Thank you for watching another deep dive from around the way. Like, comment, subscribe, let us know what crazy topic you want us to cover next. Have a good one.